And we're live. Welcome to Fakewhale, everybody. Today's guest, we have Nicolas Sassoon. How's it going, man?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. It's a pleasure to officially meet you, even though we have bumped shoulders in circles for a while now. But I'm super excited to talk to you because I've been a fan of your work for a while, and I was actually just looking. One of my early purchases on Tez was RGB Study #1.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, cool piece. I was just looking at it again, and I think it's a great lead into your work and something I find really interesting about your work. But before going into that, I would like for you to maybe give a little introduction to yourself, because I know you've been doing this for a long time, and I don't want to make the mistake of being like, ever since NFTs started, you became, an artist or something. I know you've been doing this for a while, and I would love to hear what you're really the inception of your artistic career would be. Would you say?
Right. So yeah, I'm 41 years old, born 1981, and I'm originally from France. So I went to art school from 2001 till 2007, graduated my MFA, and then after that I moved to Vancouver, BC, Canada in 2008. And so I've been making art for a while, but
Was the move to Canada for school?
It was not really. It was more like after school, after I graduated, and I wasn't really particularly excited or inspired to go anywhere in Europe in particular. And I feel like I grew up with a lot of cultural references from North America, so it felt really attractive to me to go to North America just to kind of experience it, and it felt like it was the right moment to do it. So yeah, I moved there with my best friend, completely sort of out of the blue. And we picked Vancouver a little bit randomly, thinking that, if we didn't like it, we could go somewhere else. And we ended up staying there for 14 years. So I guess it was a good pick. But yeah, so I've been making art for maybe 20 years and more seriously for 15. And I think my practice really sort of emerged, my practice as it is today really emerged when I moved to Vancouver, because I arrived there and I had no studio. I didn't really have the means to make physical work. So I just had my laptop. And I really decided to focus on exploring early computer graphics because it's something I had always wanted to do. And for some reason, I never did it when I was in art school. So I really focused on that. And it's a paradox because I sort of gave up on making art at the time. I was like, I'm going to focus on this because it really speaks to me. And whether it turns out to be art or something else doesn't really matter. I just want to focus on this. And yeah, from then onwards, things just kind of developed. 2009, I joined this internet art collective called Computers Club, who became really active and prominent from 2009 to 2014. Started meeting people in Vancouver who invited me to do shows, and then got my first gallery representation in 2012. And yeah, I mean, ever since I've been focusing on mostly contemporary arts, but also working a lot with digital art and electronic music festivals, working with fashion, working with architects, trying to do a lot of different things, working with net art. And then, yeah, I minted my first work in February 2021, minted my first NFT. And things definitely took on a different sort of scale or amplitude with NFT. But yeah, I've been doing this for a minute.
Excellent. Yeah, that's great synopsis. I'm curious, what were you doing before? I guess when you moved, you didn't have access to studio equipment and your traditional art making tools. But before that, were you more interested in traditional arts, or when you went to school, were you trained through all that, or what did you go to school for? I'm just wondering what led into the digital art, if you were doing something else before, or if it was graphic design and illustration you were into always, or.
Right. I went to fine art school that was really focused on new media and communication. So it was an MFA. an MFA course, so like Masters of Fine Arts. And at the time when I was in school, I had like a much more conceptual practice, but I also had a much more sort of like technically involved practice. I would work a lot with technicians who would help me like build different structures. Like
Okay.
I would do like interactive installations. I would do a lot of video production with like compositing and After Effects. But my practice was sort of very scattered. It was more, I guess it was more like a conceptual art type practice where like I wasn't really falling under one specific medium, even though there was a strong focus on digital and screen-based works. It was sort of, there were like prints, there were video, there were interactive installations, and there wasn't necessarily like an aesthetic sort of thread. Things were just kind of like experiments going in different directions. Yeah. And so after that, I don't know. When I was in art school, I was looking at painters and I was really jealous of painters. I was like, fuck, they really have their sinks are like set up. They have like, they have their canvas, they have their oil. Like every day they come to the studio, they're like, this is it. That's what I'm going to focus on. And I think I was really longing for something like that. I was really longing for like reducing the sort of framework of my practice and being like, here are my tools. That's what like that. These are going to be the only tools I use, and I'm going to be very focused, and I'm going to try and exhaust this sort of like small area and see how much I can get out of like these tools and just like this specific visual language. And yeah, I think like consciously or unconsciously, that's what I try to create. Like right after art school, I completely sort of like changed my practice to really focus on that idea.
I totally relate to that envy of painters. I have it all the time where I'm just like, man, that
Mhm.
seems nice. They just get up in the morning. They don't have to think about what they're going to do or like how or all these like other things. It's like, I've been working on this painting for 3 weeks and I'm going to work on it for another month. And that's what I'm going to do. And that seems just something so like, I don't know, relaxing about that, I guess. But it's probably highly romanticized for people like us who are more scattered in our studio practice because I'm still all over the place. But it does lead nicely into, you said you were always interested in early computer graphics, but you never really just like focused on it. But I would also like to know, what about early computer graphics themselves? Like, was it that drew you to them? Was it like
Mhm.
nostalgia to a childhood past that you really liked? Were you really into gaming or something like that? Or
Mhm.
was it something completely different?
I mean, I definitely think that maybe like nostalgia was a starting point, because, and I don't know if nostalgia is the right word, but I think
Mhm.
early computer graphics were my first major aesthetic experience. Like I have like very strong memories of uh, the first like computer systems and video game systems I used to play with as a child. So like the Atari 2600 or the Apple Macintosh. And I mean, I think like nostalgia is can be a starting point in any sort of practice, but it's never really an end in itself. Because to me, like what's driving me to like keep making the work that I make is that I I see a visual language in early computer graphics that to me is in conversation with a lot of other visual language. And so it's not this little time capsule that's like stuck in the 80s or the 90s and it's just like there forever, and the goal of this visual language is to evoke that moment in time. It's more, well, there are like specific like formal aspects of that visual language that are really exciting, that are in conversation with abstraction, that are in conversation with optical art, with kinetic art, with painting, with moving image, with experimental film. And this is what interests me. It interests me because it's sort of it I think it's sort of it encapsulates and it crosses a lot of different sort of interests that I have in visual arts in general. Uh, so yeah, I mean, to make the long story short, definitely like my childhood was like a starting point for that aesthetic experience, and then eventually, when I was in art school, I was really interested in like the history of abstraction in painting. I was really interested in optical art and kinetic art. So it sort of just crossed all these like fields of interests, and yeah.
I see all of that in your work. everything that you're saying
Okay, that's
really
good. Then
nicely.
I'm not completely off the marks.
And I really like what you said about nostalgia can be a starting point, but it's never an end. I always think about that because whenever I see artwork, there's so much artwork that I feel the end is nostalgia, you know, and I always can sense that or something, and it always is a detraction. It doesn't sit right with me. Nostalgia as a point, as an end, as you said. So I really like how you said that. So, and it does again bring very nicely into like the things that you are interested in, particularly that you choose to, you know, focus on not just the aesthetics, but the actual, I guess you could say, subject of the pieces, whether it be abstract or architectural. Of course, these modes of working could be applied in any direction, but the way that you use them is specific to you, of course. And I'm interested in those choices as well. First of all, like the architecture, excuse me, super compelling, in the way that you use it is super interesting. And I'm curious if you have like a background or family background in architecture or interest in architecture. But also you brought up optical art, which your work obviously does a lot too. And it made me even think of like those books where you just like optical illusion books from a kid, which not to bring nostalgia into it, but I think that's directly related to what you're talking about, right? Like the optical illusion. And I guess, so this question's getting long. I'm going to parcel it down and start with one. And it's not even one I brought up yet, but this word keeps coming up, and I love it, and I always have, but I always mispronounce it. Is it moyer?
Moire,
Moyer? Yeah,
yeah.
Moyer. Okay. It's French, right?
I think so, yeah. I
And I
think it
think
is.
it's
I'm not
derived
sure.
from something. I think it's derived from a word to do something with water. But so this concept is super compelling and it's super interesting. It's like optical illusory-ish, but it's also something I speak, or it's something I think you speak directly to, the interaction of pixel on screen, things like that. And I've been trying to pronounce that word all my life. Maybe you could talk about that phenomenon. Maybe you could talk about a little bit about that phenomenon and how it shows up in your work, and that kind of does tie into like your interest in the subject matter of your work too, if that makes
Right,
sense.
right. Well, I think it all starts from the screen, because I've been so focused on making screen-based works that I've come to consider the screen as this sort of space that is a space of optical illusion, but also a space where depths and the notion of depths is constantly shifting. Because when we work on our screens, or when we watch a movie, or when we play video game, or when we read an article, we're constantly shifting between spaces. Sometimes it's a space like a first person video game shooter where like we're sort of like immersed in a first person view. Sometimes it's a space that looks like a two-dimensional space. Sometimes it's a workspace. Sometimes it's a sort of a metaphor of like cascading windows when we use like Windows or Mac OS. And so this idea of like an ever shifting space to me is it's like really essential to like what makes screens interesting in terms of visual experiences, because we're constantly shifting. And so that goes back to also like my interest in optical art and in abstraction. And moire is a very simple optical phenomenon that happens, you know, in the physical world and also in the digital world, when you have like two images overlapping, and the overlap of the two images creates the illusion of a third image. So, you know, there's like a lot of artists in optical art like Jesus Rafael Soto or like Carlos Cruz Diez who have used that. But also it became like a thing that was like really annoying in like early digital photography, when like people would resize their digital photos on computers. And then when you would have like an intricate motif or like a fabric, and you would resize it, and it would create like all these weird artifacts. So it's like this optical phenomenon that like constantly travels between the physical and the digital. And in my work, it sort of happened accidentally, because I was just doing all these experimentations with different sort of hard edge pixel textures. And eventually I started overlapping them. And I realized it was creating like this very interesting sort of like glitchy interference. And then I really looked a little deeper into the history of moire and how it worked. And I tried to like integrate it more and more into my work. And I guess another thing that's like really important to me, especially when it comes to abstraction and to like the use of moire, is how it's always tied to me to natural forces and atmospheric forces. Because when I grew up, I would play a lot of video games, but I would also spend a lot of time outside. I've always done like a lot of like outdoor activities. I used to live in like coastal cities by the ocean, so I guess like natural forces and like natural landscapes and this sort of sensory experience have always been like pretty like prominent in my upbringing. And a lot of the abstract animations I make, I think they're trying to recall this sort of experience. They're trying to like represent or evoke this experience through abstraction, through moire patterns, through like very simple sort of visual means. And again, I think that's the thing that really fascinates me and interests me with screens, is how like you can try and evoke much bigger spaces, like notions of depth, notions of flatness, notions of like natural forces, through a very minimal language, through something that constantly oscillates between like a very flat image and something that feels like it has like a lot of depth. And that's kind of where moire comes into play in my work.
I love that. And the idea of the two-dimensional screen being actually like a portal almost that can be, you know, as deep of a three-dimensional space or as flat as a two-dimensional space as you choose, depending on what you're looking at or what the artist is showing you or whatever. That's very compelling. Very, very compelling. And then also the use of architecture starts to make sense in this context as well. And I think that in your work, something that happens, and it's completely outside of even like an art thing. I feel it's just like a satisfaction that you get from your work sometimes, where like it's almost like a trick where something's rotating and all of a sudden there's a moment where it just kind of like flips on itself and you're like, holy shit, it just like, you know, it reversed, but it didn't actually. That's just the optical illusion of it, right? And
Right.
but that's something that like a child even likes, you know. That's like something you can go to a science museum and enjoy, and
Yeah.
because it gives you this visceral experience of like of reality changing or something for you very quickly, where you get to experience like a flip of perspective which you're providing, which and I love that. Like I've looked at your work for long periods of time, just getting a kick out of all of it, but it's also so intelligent and refined. And where do you think the refinedness of your work comes from? Is that like your art school background, or is that like having design background or admiring like fashion industry or anything like that? Because you do have a very refined feeling to all of your work that is not necessarily inherent. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, well, thank you first. And I don't know where it comes from. I think like maybe part of the answer comes from the fact that my work really emerged in 2008, 2009. So I just had moved to Vancouver and I started making all these experiments around early computer graphics, and they were kind of piling up on my computer. And eventually I created a blog where I would post them. And I think that was like a really important moment because I started spending more and more time online, and I realized that you know, when you post something online, there's like an attention economy that happens, and you have to captivate your audience very quickly. You have to like put something in front of their eyes that will retain their attention, and if you lose that moment, then it's over and they move on. And yes, so like that was the context in which like my current practice emerged. And so I think there was always in the back of my head this idea that like the work needs to be very captivating. It needs to be like very catchy visually. It needs to like grasp your attention. And I mean, I think that corresponds also to like certain like aesthetic inclinations on my end in terms of like what I like visually and like what I appreciate in terms of aesthetic experience. Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly where it comes from. And then another part is probably, yeah,
I
go
don't
ahead.
mean to interrupt you, but before I want to ask you about the blog. Just like, where was the blog? Was it on Tumblr or not? Or
It was on Blogspot. It was a
Blogspot?
term.
Okay.
Yeah, it It was on the
Early,
blogspot.
old school.
It was called you make me so happy.blogspot.com. Yeah, it was. And
Yeah,
no,
that's
it's funny because
hardcore.
like at the time I was like, I was, I completely like gave up on the idea of making art, and I was like, I'm just gonna do this because it makes me happy and because I'm having like so much fun
Oh, so that's
experimenting
where the
with.
name comes from.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Ah,
where the name
cool.
comes from. Yeah,
And then
and so
also
it
too, I
was. I
think,
mean, it was this idea of like visual pleasure, I guess, like or visual joy.
yeah,
Like when like you look at something, and I think like a lot of like the era from like 2008 onwards into like 2012, 2014, like that Tumblr era, there was like really like this sort of emergence of like the idea of like visual joy, where like you
yeah,
look at graphics and you're like, wow, like this is really like, yeah, this is like bringing me like a certain amount of like visual satisfaction.
yeah.
Uh, and so that definitely has been like a big part of
Well, the
my.
emergence, even like not to go down that path too far, but the emergence of the word aesthetic as just a word to describe something. Are you familiar with that? Like, have you heard this? Like, that's so aesthetic. Like, what
Mhm.
does that, like, what the fuck does that even mean? Like that,
Yeah.
but what it means, that came from Tumblr, like around the time you're talking about, where people were just making like using C4D to make lush 3D graphics with like fucking apples and shit that looked like hyper digital but hyper real, and they were just like satisfying to the eye, and people be like, that's so aesthetic, like, okay.
Mhm.
But that's such an interesting thing because that's around the time that vaporwave kind of came out, which was completely aesthetic based. We're in like talking about vapidity too in aesthetics, I think, right? We're talking about like pure visual pleasure, like visual hedonism, like has to have, it doesn't have anything to do with like context or fucking concept or nothing. It's just
Yeah.
visual hedonism, which before that, like, and it still is looked down upon, but I feel like the digital art scene and the internet art scene certainly have tried to validate it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of like a cycle that comes back. It keeps coming back in like, uh, like in like visual culture over and
Yeah.
over, for sure.
But it makes sense. It goes along hand in hand with what I just said about how your work is so satisfying. You get that,
Right.
you get kind of a rush sometimes, or you get like that joy sometimes of like when that you're let in on the secret all of a sudden or something, and you get that. It's almost that. I feel like more, whatever how you say it, is somewhere within that ASMR realm too. Would you say like that people
Yeah.
like
Right. Yeah.
respond in
I
that
mean,
way?
there's definitely that component of it, and to me, it's always like it's a there's always this sort of tension or this sort of negotiation between something that's just going to be like visually pleasing and also what I related to or what I connected to, because like my approach of abstraction is I have a very hard time like doing abstraction for the sake of abstraction. I need to connect abstraction to like to things. So sometimes it's like natural forces, sometimes it's going to be architecture, sometimes it's going to be something else. Because to me, that's when abstraction becomes like super interesting and super exciting. Is like when you see something that's very minimal, but there's like this sort of like visual cues in it that are gonna sort of like orient your interpretation towards like, is this
Hmm.
like a natural landscape, or is this like the texture of like a skin or like a building or something, or is it representing like some sort of architectural structure? And it's almost like there's that idea of like less is more, when like you're looking at an image and there's not a ton of visual information, but there's just enough so like your mind starts projecting itself into it, and you're going to try and make something out of it, you're going to try and interpret it. And that's really kind of my approach of abstraction. So like with Moire patterns and with a lot of my work, that's the thing. I always try to connect it to something tangible to me. And so like all the Moire patterns on my website, if you look at them, usually like they're all named after natural forces. Either like it's tree bark or like wind or rain or like the ocean or sunset or like a storm or like a blizzard, et cetera, et cetera. It's always connected to these sort of like physical sensations, and how does these physical sensations can be somehow like suggested visually through like a very minimal visual language. Because otherwise, if I do something that's just purely visual and purely visual pleasure, I actually like don't get any satisfaction out of it. I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, I need to go back a few steps and see where that clicks or where that connects with something else.
That's perfect. Yeah, because otherwise it's just kind of like playing with tech, which is also fun or whatever, but like the
Yeah,
art
for
comes, I
sure.
guess, in meaning. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Can we talk maybe just a little bit about the tech behind it? Because I have no idea how you make your work, like not a fucking clue, like what
Right.
programs you even use. And you don't have to talk about the programs or give away any secrets, but could you just talk maybe a little bit about your like studio practice, if you will?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's no big secret behind it. It's I use Photoshop and Flash, which is called now Animate, which still exists. But I use like
Super
very, very
fun.
simple tools. I basically use I use functions of any like graphic tool like Photoshop or Corel Draw or like whatever software, like image editing software you want to use. But I use like maybe, like 1 or 2% of the functions of these programs. Um,
Yeah.
and I use like functions that are like the very backbone of the program. So um, the Moire patterns, I designed them in Photoshop. I literally have like documents where I start making lines of hard edge pixels
Mhm.
and then I distort them and then I copy paste them and then I create like these whole fields of them. And so I have like backgrounds and then I have foregrounds and the two image overlap. And so it's like it's a lot of like very, very simple functions. It's everything is made visually. There's no code behind it and it's just very time consuming. That's the thing. So like I often do like this sort of like behind the scenes or like making of tweets on Twitter, or like sometimes when I do like lectures, I show people how I do it. And people are excited first because they're like, oh, like now I know how you make it. And then like when they realize how I make it, they're not excited at all because they realize how time consuming and tedious it is. And they're like, okay, so maybe I won't try this anymore.
Yeah. You're
But
like,
yeah, it
there's a
kind of
reason
goes
it's
back
only
to like
me.
the idea of it kind of goes back to the idea of painting and how like in what attracted me a lot in painting is the fact that like you have a very limited set of tools. Uh, and I think at the end of art school, I felt really overwhelmed with the fact that I had like way too many tools at my disposal. And even when you think of like a computer and all the tools you have available on a computer, whether it's for like photography or film or like 3D sculpture or like image editing, video editing, like it's endless. It's literally like endless. Like all the tools you have in your, and like what are my tools? Is it all of them? Or is it only a small fraction? And obviously like that answer is like super subjective. There's no like right or wrong answer, but like for me, I needed to like really narrow it down. I wanted to have a very limited set of tools because I loved seeing that come into play in like a lot of abstraction and minimal art, where like somebody would like pick a very simple set of tools and try to get as much as possible out of it. Like I love the idea of working with restraints or with constraints. So that's exactly what I did. And so yeah, like there's no like magic like obscure softwares that I use. It's I make everything with like the Adobe Creative Suites, but I could make it with like GIMP or Corel Draw, or I could make it with like another software. It wouldn't matter. It's just I'm using this very, very, very simple function that people don't want to use because it just takes too long to use them.
I think that's wonderful. And do you do the animations even like in Photoshop and shit? Do you just make multiple frames and
I,
that's the
I animate in
animation?
Flash. I
Okay.
use
Which
I
is
use
not even a thing, right? Anymore?
Well, it's not a thing anymore. Now it's called Animate, so it still exists, but
Oh,
it's not really used to like export Flash animations, which were like .swf. But like now, the Flash format is not supported with current web browsers, so that has become like
yeah.
completely obsolete. But you can still export. You can still use Animate to export like GIF animations or videos or image sequence,
Okay.
and it's still part of the Adobe Creative Suite. And it's basically just like a keyframe sort of like
Mhm.
timeline thing. So I could use After Effects, or I could use Premiere, or I could use like another software. I decided to use Flash because that's the one I like to use. uh, but it's not really, I guess like my point is like it's not really software specific. it's, I use hard edge pixels. So it's like when you go
Yeah,
to the
which
brush
is
section, you select the
yeah.
one pixel brush, and that's it. And that's what I use. And I use limited color palettes. And then I, whenever you resize an image on Photoshop or on like another software, you use a specific algorithm that either is going to like blur out the pixels when the image gets resized, or it's going to keep them crisp. So the original algorithm historically is called nearest neighbor, and nearest neighbor takes an image and like stretch it but doesn't blur anything, so it really looks super ugly when you use that on a photo, because it just makes everything looks terrible. But for my work it's perfect, because if you have like an image that's like 120 by 120 and you want it to be like crisp at like 240 by 240 or 480 by 480, etc., then you use that, and it basically like it scales you can scale things up and down and keep pixels like really like nice and crisp. It's just like very
How do you
basic.
use that?
Sorry?
How do you use that?
Just by like resizing images, and like when
What though? Like what uses that algorithm, or like what programs use algorithm with the
in
versus the other
Photoshop,
one?
like
Just
when
Photoshop.
you go to Photoshop and like you go to like image size, you can pick the type of like
Resizing
resampling.
algorithm.
Yeah,
Oh,
the resampling.
I guess I've never just done that. I'm so not technical.
Yeah.
When it comes to that shit. But I mean, I love what you're saying, because it sounds like you are much more than me, it sounds like, but how freeing that limitation that you set for yourself sounds. I did an interview a while back where I talked about how freeing limitations can be, because I like limitations too. I don't like staring at infinity because it's daunting, it's paralyzing. I want, some place to start from, I guess you could say. And
Right.
what you're saying is like almost like ultimate freedom, because you're not even program specific. You're like, I don't give a shit. Like I can use MS Paint and make something, like as cool as what I did in Photoshop. So that is very, very cool. And you did answer the question I was going to ask, if anything you do is generative, because surely people are mistaken at times. I could assume, right? People sometimes mistake your work for generative.
Yeah, and I mean, I have this conversation with some people who are like more or less involved in like the idea of like generative art, and I guess it really depends on like what one's definition of generative is. But let's say like it's not algorithmic art, that's for sure. It's not code based. It's not generated with code. It's very much, I would say, to me, like the reference is more like analog animation, and how like analog animators, like even like Norman McLaren, people like that who like worked on like frame by frame stop motion, how this kind of workflow can be translated to a digital workflow using the image editing software that are available today. It's very much like that, because it's I'm using this very, very simple and very analog like animating methods, but I mean, I could like draw it, but if you look at my aesthetic, that wouldn't make any sense, because my aesthetic is based on computer language. So everything is happening on the computer. So is it generative? Yes and no. It depends on one's definition of like generative, I would say.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
at
Generative
first,
doesn't even need a computer.
my first impression was like, hell no, it's not generative. But then I had a few conversations with people who are like really interested in like the idea behind generative art. And I guess generative art is like a very large umbrella term for a lot of different practice. And now I don't really know if it's generative or not. I guess it depends on one's definition.
Absolutely. I've interviewed quite a few generative artists now, and my definition has been blown open as well. But I've always considered like even like a spider web is generative in a sense, and then there's artists who've actually used spiders to make art out of spider webs, and it's like, that's generative. Sure, yeah, totally. Even though that's a one of one still or whatever, but it's generative. So I mean, the definition of what is generative, who the fuck knows? Like, but it's definitely compelling and interesting. I'm curious about your entry into the NFT world. Like doing digital work always, and then NFT, like the dawn of NFTs, that's an obvious move. But I would like to hear maybe a little bit about your specific move into NFTs, and then or I guess let's say Web3, and then bridging into like, I know you've done some pretty awesome shows and had some pretty awesome opportunities since you started minting, which I guess was only a year and a half ago. Almost 2 years now. But I would like to hear a little bit about that. So I guess just your Web3 experience, lay it on me.
Right, my Web3 experience. Well, I feel like I was like a little late to the party, but I guess I wasn't so late. I, uh, I actually received like invitation to Super Rare and Foundation in the fall of 2020, and I was super skeptical at first. I was like, "What is this shit? It's like this sounds like a scam." uh, and I think the
It
reason,
is. It still is.
but I mean, heck, we might as well go with it. The reason I was really skeptical too is because I've been doing my work for like 14 or 15 years now, and I've been invited to like so many marketplaces that claim that they were going to revolutionize like the digital art market, and every single time it flopped. So I had like a very like I had like a lot of skepticism, and it came from like a pretty obvious place because I had been like disappointed by like many previous attempts at like monetizing digital art practices. And I had like a few conversations with people after I received the invitation, and some people were like, "No, you should pay attention to this. It's like really important." Like one person who really convinced me is actually like my girlfriend or my partner, Kiri Doran, who's a former gallery director who also like worked with different startups dealing with crypto and NFT. And she was like, "No, you should definitely pay attention to this. It's going somewhere, and it's kind of like perfectly suited for your practice." So I try to educate myself for like a couple months prior to entering the space, and eventually in February I decided to like mint my first work on Foundation. And at this time I was really going in with like very very low expectations. I was like, I have nothing to lose, like I might as well try this. And then it's been absolutely insane. I mean, my first works were like for like 2.15 ETH, and I had like priced it at like 0.75. So to me, it was already like, wow, really surprising in a good way. And then I just kept minting work, and they kept selling, and I had this feeling that that this was like a really good chance for me, and that I should not like let it pass. So I went in like 500%, and I sort of like put everything on the side, and I focused on NFTs like really really hard. And yeah, and I mean it's been like, it's definitely been life changing, and I don't think it's not even like a strong way of describing it. It's been completely life changing. What's been really exciting too is the whole, like the culture of mutual support, and like all the amazing artists I've met. And I've also become like a pretty avid collector, because very early on, after I sold like a few works, um, some of some of my mentors in the space really pushed me to collect. They were like, you should really start like investing in NFTs, because you're an artist, you have a good eye, you've been looking at digital art for like the last 15 years. So, you have your taste, and it's your personal taste, but like you can tell when somebody is like really putting a lot of time and effort in their practice, and when somebody is not. And so yeah, you should invest in NFTs. And also there is this whole culture of like wealth redistribution and mutual support that's like pretty interesting, and that aligns with your ethos. So you should look into that. And yeah, that part has been like super exciting as well, because and I feel like that's kind of one of the things to me that is like the most exciting about this space, is how it really fundamentally changed the idea of like what potentially a successful artist is, and what sort of responsibilities come with it, and like how does that artist as a cultural actor operates in the ecosystem, and the sort of exchanges that happen. because I mean, in the art world, you see attempts at there's been many attempts at wealth redistribution and mutual support, but usually it's sort of squashed really early on, or it doesn't really, it has like a very hard time sustaining itself over time. Whereas like with NFTs, I feel like the structure is kind of perfect for that. So yeah, I mean the opportunities. I've had like this year, I've done like a few exciting shows with Bright Moments and Quantum and a few other people, but actually now like that has become my focus. I feel like for the last 18 months, I've been really focusing on selling works, and now I want to really focus on actually like producing exhibitions and events, because I have the means to do so, and I have lots of ideas and lots of projects that I really want to see come to fruition. So yeah, that's going to be like my focus for like the years to come, is to like produce physical events.
I love it. I hear you too. I'm in the same boat with that. But when did you get into Tezos? Well, not long after you minted on Foundation then.
Yeah, I think in April 2021. It's actually Pixel Fool who onboarded me on Tezos. We started talking, and he was like, "Hey, like this platform called Heketnak?" I was like, "Yeah, I've seen it, but it looks kind of complicated." And he was like, "Okay, come on." And like he took like half a day to onboard me on the platform, and so yeah, I think yeah.
Yeah. Now that I look, I have your second mint ever. I didn't even realize that was your second on Tezos ever.
Right, the
Wow.
RGB study. Yeah, it's like the second one. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. Right. Yeah. Right
Mhm.
when you started, so you went Foundation. You went into Tezos pretty quick. You went on Super Rare right away too. Is that
Yeah.
right? Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the first three. I started working on OpenSea a little bit, but like not so much after that.
Where do you collect?
I collect mostly, like last year I collected a lot on Foundation and a lot on Tezos, on like Hikit and Object. Never collected on Super Rare. Not really sure why, but maybe because the prices were too high last year, and I was like, I can't afford that stuff. Like now things are different. But yeah, I mostly collect on Foundation and on Object nowadays.
Right on.
Yeah,
Yeah, cool.
and on art blocks a little bit. Like I'm starting to have more
Nice.
art blocks projects.
Nice. Very nice.
Mhm.
So that's all great. So I'm gonna just shift gears here in the home stretch and just like personal questions, like what are you into, or like what I want to know music, and I want to know like maybe film. Do you get into films at all? As a French Canadian, I
Oh
would
yeah,
hope you get into film.
I get really. I used to be like I used to be obsessed in like Italian horror movies from the 80s, like Giallos.
Nice.
They're called Giallos. So when I was in art school, I actually had a huge collection of VHS. I would go to. There was a time where like a lot of video rental places were just kind of like getting rid of their like overstock, and so I would go to like different like video rental stores, or I would look online and I would buy like old VHS. And I think at some point I had up to like more than 1,000 VHS.
Oh shit! You
Yeah,
ain't
yeah, I had
joking.
like a
Damn.
huge.
That
Yeah, I had
just
like
takes up space even.
that takes a lot of space. Yeah, I didn't have a lot of books, but I had a lot of VHS tapes, and they all went moldy because I was storing them in like
Oh
a
shit.
really not a good place. So like they all basically disappeared. But yeah, I was really into horror and sci-fi films and literature during my upbringing. A lot of like US horror and sci-fi, a lot of like Italian horror and sci-fi, um, a lot of like classic sci-fi literature like Ursula Le Guin, Philip K. Dick, Ray
Awesome.
Bradbury, like all the
Yeah.
classics. Um, and
I can kind of attach that to it. I
in
love
music,
Ursula Le
I've been
Guin.
really lazy. Sorry, what do you say?
Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, I like sci-fi a lot, but I love Ursula Le Guin quite a bit. Like she's Left Hand of Darkness is huge,
Yeah.
and so is the one that doesn't really fit in, that short little parable about like the psychiatrist. You know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't think so.
Uh, the guy who can like predict the future in his dreams, and then he goes to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist like abuses the power and changes the world, or like he can change the world as his dreams and shit like
Oh,
that.
I haven't read that one. Actually, Ursula Le Guin is like probably like the one I know the least. I think I've read a couple. I've read like The Left Hand of Darkness and like the one
Yeah,
that
that's the one.
yeah, the one that happens on like another planet, and it's like I forgot. It's been a minute since I read them, so
That's
uh,
fair enough.
yeah,
Big fan though, big fan. So as far as
yeah.
music, yeah, it's like music. What's up with that with you?
I mean, music. I've always been very lazy because I've always had like very like a lot of friends quite involved in music, so I've sort of like heavily relied on them uh, to define my music taste. Definitely like leaning towards like electronic music. A lot of Detroit techno, electro has been like a focus. A lot of more like experimental electronic music. Um, going from like Brian Eno or like Steve Reich and like everything that trickles down from this sort of music genres to today. Really love the music of my friend Yusu. Really love like the music of Sarah Davachi, who's like more like synths, sort of like electroacoustic music. Definitely like a stronger focus on like electronic music for sure. I have this thing where I talked about this with like a lot of friends recently, where I I don't listen to music anymore as like this dedicated moment where I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna like do nothing and listen to music right now, which I
Mm.
think is a bit of a problem because I always listen to music when I'm working, and so I'm trying to listen to music that's not gonna be too distracting and too intense. Otherwise, it's gonna take me away from my work, and so that has like shifted my music listening habits towards things that are like a little more flat,
Mhm.
and I've decided to buy a turntable recently just to like play vinyls from my friend and to be like, okay, I'm not gonna do anything. I'm just gonna play this vinyl right now, and it's gonna be this little ritual and this little moment to like actually listen to music and not do anything else.
I love that. I actually did that exact thing. I started listening to vinyl in my studio exclusively to have a more personal relationship with music again, and like dedicate time to it and whatever. But I totally get what you mean about when you're only listening to music while you're working in the studio or whatever, how you can get into these like um, little divots almost of like you're only listening to stuff that's like really easy. It's like it's
Yeah.
not like you're not like because you just want background noise for what you're doing, but now you think that's your taste or something, and it's
No,
like, nah, not
exactly.
really.
Exactly.
And you miss out on like the art of music, like other people's creative like outputs that are just as powerful as the painting you're working on or the art piece you're working on, but in a different form.
Yeah.
But it is difficult. Like I can't listen to rap when I'm doing anything that takes a lot of thought because I need to listen to the story. I need to listen to what they're saying. It can't just be background because it creates a moire effect. You could say it doesn't mesh. So I
Yeah.
totally get it. And I was gonna ask when you're working, do you always listen to music or sometimes are you in silence?
It's 50-50. I would say like or maybe even like two-third, one-third, like two-third of silence and one-third of music. Uh, and music in when I work is also used as sort of like a fuel, like an energy source to kind of like get me going.
Hmm.
So it goes back to what you just said. It's like definitely not like the same type of like listening than like when you sit down and you're going to play music just to enjoy and to like take it in. Um, so yeah, I typically like work with no music because I realize that sometimes music just kind of like distracts me too much, or I will put like some like very simple sound frequencies in the back to like help with focus.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of what I do usually.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And the frequency thing, like I do the same thing, and I've encountered now multiple people who are really into those, like I don't know, beats and just like listening to frequencies of different things
Mhm.
for usage. Like I'm definitely interested in, and I use it as well. Like sound is almost like a drug, like you're saying, where you can use it as an energy boost, or you can use it for this or that, and depending on the different sounds and whatever. So thanks for sharing all that. That's really interesting. So in
Mhm.
closing, is there anything that you want to anything like you have coming up that you want to promote, or you're working on a big project right now? You did say that you're taking the time to kind of do shows and expose the work and create new work. I also know that you recently moved into a new home, so congratulations on
Mhm.
that. I don't know if
There it
that's where we
is.
are right now. Yeah, I can see
Yeah,
nice,
as you
very
can
bare
see,
still.
it's pretty empty. It's pretty bare,
Will
but
Will
it's
this be where
coming
you're
together.
working? Will you
Sorry?
be working from home? Will you be working from the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
place?
I'm working from home. I used to have a studio when I lived in Vancouver, um, because I had like a great deal and I had like a great studio. But I just moved to Montreal and I decided I wanted to have a live workspace. So
How far is Vancouver and Montreal? Are those like
it's pretty
opposite or?
far. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like the complete opposite.
yeah.
So like Vancouver is like, above Seattle,
Yeah.
and Montreal is
I
above New York. So
I was curious about that at the very beginning when you said that, because I know that Montreal has a very I mean, French there is like the same as English, right? Almost in Montreal, it's very
yeah,
French Canadian. Is
it's
Vancouver
very,
the same or no?
sorry?
Is Vancouver the same in that regard or
Oh
no?
no, not at all. Like Vancouver is like completely Anglophone.
So why did you choose of all of Canada?
Right,
Everybody from France that I hear goes to Montreal. I was going to ask this question earlier, but I didn't want
right.
to detract.
Well, I had been to Montreal a couple times when I was still studying, and Montreal is like a great city, and I really like it. And I think I mean, I've been here for like 3 weeks, and I already love it. Uh, there's lots of French people from France in Montreal, and it's almost like uh, it was almost like a bit of a turnoff at the time because I wanted to experience something new first, and I wanted to become fluent in English, and I wanted to like
Mm,
discover like a completely different culture. And I mean, with total respect to like Quebec and Montreal, it's a completely different culture here, but there's also like a huge French community from France. So it's already like strange for me because I walk on the streets and there's like bakeries everywhere. There's like all this reference to French culture where I'm like,
mhm.
this feels like super familiar, but also I can tell I'm like in North America, but it's kind of strange. And I think at first I was attracted to go to Vancouver or to like an Anglophone city because I wanted to experience a different culture. I wanted to experience like North American culture. And to me, like Montreal was like this weird middle ground. It was not like fully the whole thing. Uh, so yeah, that's why. And I mean, I really, I really love that part about Vancouver and about like the Pacific Northwest because it's like it has its own sort of like vibe and culture. And I definitely like really enjoyed that for the longest time. And here is completely different. And it's still like I still have to catch myself because I want to talk English to people, but like 75% of like the city talks French, and people get kind of offended when like you respond to them in English when they know you talk French. So I'm like, I have to like really catch myself. Yeah, it's really strange. It's really strange. It's like it's a mix of like familiarity and like new, and it's but it's cool. I really like it. It's a beautiful city. It's super vibrant. There's like it's definitely like there's a lot of like really cool bars and really cool restaurants, and I'm like in a very nice area, so I feel very lucky.
That's awesome. That's really funny though too, because I visited Montreal once, and it feels like a foreign, it is a foreign country to America, but it feels like
Right,
like we drove there, from the border, and it was like nothing,
right.
but it felt like we had entered somewhere very different. But I loved it, and they have a great music festival that I don't know if it's still going on, but Pop Montreal. That's the reason I was there. But it was like
Mm,
a indie music festival that they do every year, and it's kind of like if you ever heard of South by Southwest in Austin,
right,
Texas,
yeah.
where
Okay,
like they
looks
did,
similar.
it's like that in Montreal. Very cool. All like the venues
Yeah,
open up to it and the stuff. So, anyways, that's congratulations on the move. Congratulations on the new home, the new
thank
city.
you,
It
thank
is a
you so
beautiful
much.
city. I love it. Is there anything you want to promote before we call it a session here? Is there anything like do you have a
Yeah,
drop
sure. I
coming
mean,
in or
I
your
have
shows?
like I'm releasing a new series actually at the end of the month with Refraction DAO. I'm actually gonna try and finish them right after this call. It's a series called Cabins, and it's actually a series of architectural studies, and they're pretty playful and colorful and fun and sort of like different from like anything I've released so far. So I'm excited to release them, and they'll be released on Tezos. And
Where on
yeah,
Tezos?
like well, we're still figuring that part out. I think we're gonna create like a mint page, so it's gonna be a random minting thing where you don't really know what you're minting, but then
Okay.
you have to go to your wallet to see what you minted.
How
But
many of
that's
these will there be theoretically?
sorry.
How many theoretically of those?
There's I think there's gonna be 8 different animations, and then 2 panoramic animations where you have like several architectural studies on them, and they're all going to be editions of 20 or editions of 10. So I think in totals it's going to come out to like 500 or 600 editions for sale in total.
Cool.
And they'll probably be sold for like somewhere around like 50 Tezos, but I'm still figuring out the details. I actually have to like lock down the details today, so it's
That's exciting though. And what did you say they're called? Playhouse? What were they called?
cabins.
Cabins. Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's
Because
really
they
intriguing.
really,
Yeah.
some of them really look like little log cabins, or like little cabins, and some of them look like much more futuristic and sort of like warehousey.
Oh, that's really exciting. And
Yeah.
when will you drop these?
Probably at the end of the month, like during Miami Art Basel. So like
Okay.
it's with this collective called Refraction DAO, who's doing a lot of like really great projects in Web3, and they're doing a big exhibition in Miami in a really cool space. So the works will be exhibited in Miami during
Oh, cool.
Art Basel,
Okay.
and then they will be sold online as well.
Hell yeah, that's awesome. So you will have some Art Basel presence. That's December 1st through 3rd, I believe, in Miami.
Yeah.
Very fucking cool.
I'll be in another like really big show in Art Basel, but I'm still figuring out the details.
Still
So
figuring it out.
I'm not gonna jinx it, and I'm not gonna say anything. But yeah, you will definitely see me at Art Basel. I won't be there in person, but my work will be there.
That's fair too.
Yeah.
I don't personally. I'm not a big fan of Miami and going there. But
yeah, I'm
I wanted to say I do love your.
I'm right there with you.
Great, thank you for not making me alone. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
When you said cabins, it reminded me of your tree houses, and I really love your tree house pieces.
Oh,
Those
nice.
pieces are
Yeah,
fucking
thank
awesome.
you.
Yeah.
In spirit, it's like very similar, but like visually, it's very different. It's like visually,
I kind of got that sense.
Dimensional. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I kind of got the sense from you talking about that. In spirit, it might be similar to the tree houses, but visually very different. So that's exciting. I'm definitely going to be paying attention. I'm going to turn your notifications on so I don't miss that.
Thank you.
Is there anywhere you want to direct people? Is Twitter where they should go if they want to find links and everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think Twitter is definitely, like if you want to see what I'm up to, like I think my Twitter is like a great place to start, because I'm pretty on it when it comes to like promoting works. And I mean, Refraction has a crazy mailing list, so I know they'll do a lot of outreach about the project. And if you are in Miami for Art Basel, definitely like check out the Refraction DAO exhibition, because they do an amazing job. They have an amazing exhibition designer called Craig Barrow, who made like a beautiful exhibition space, an exhibition design, and NFT New York at Zero Space. And I'm sure it's going to be beautiful in Miami too. So definitely check it out.
Where would they be doing it in Miami? Do you know yet?
They're still figuring out the space because they had to like change the space last year. But they told me they're really pumped about the new space, so I think it'll be great.
Apologies to anybody who's overhearing the dump truck in the alley, but
that's
right
okay.
On. Refraction DAO, that's the name, right?
Yeah, that's the name of the organization.
That's good enough. You can figure it out from there. Cool. So everybody listening, definitely check out the Refraction DAO event in Art Basel, Miami, December 1st through 3rd. Check out Nicolas Sassoon's Twitter for everything else. And other than that, cheers. See you next time. Thank you so much, Nicolas. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and enjoy the rest of your day.
You as well, brother. Have a good one, everybody. Cheers.